Hello, my name is Angel Jasmine Captain. I'm a Management Information Systems student, and today I'll be presenting on the topic Today's Liberia. Is corruption, democracy, and education a major role in its success story? Let's begin. Diving into my table of contents, we'll start off with the introduction, which is followed by the research questions associations I picked. We'll look at the methods I used, the inferential tests I did, the results I got from that testing, and finally, we'll have a discussion on my findings. Now, with the introduction, during my deliberations on what topic to choose for this research project, I realized that I wanted to represent my country, Liberia, as a country created in 1822 as an outpost point for emancipated slaves returning from the Americas. It expanded into a colony, became a commonwealth before gaining independence in 1847, making it Africa's oldest republic and the only black state never subjected to colonial rule. But how did a mighty country with a 174-year history become one of the world's poorest today? Was it because of the two civil wars, its numerous corrupt leaders, or was it the fact that it was heavily impacted by diseases like Ebola and COVID 19? Today, such reasons won't be discussed. However, to get to the bottom of some of the nation's most pressing problems, I turned to the most important source of information available its people. In doing so, I looked at some researches and came up with these points. The first being Liberia is experiencing a democratic crisis, and that the damaging legacies of the country's 1989 to 2003 civil war, as well as the indirect colonization of the locals by free slaves, continue to control people's lives. Another quote said, "A major concern in the development of African economies is the impact of corruption on economic growth." Another said, "Literacy and democracy interact in dynamic reciprocity." And the last said, "All levels of education, human capital, including higher education human capital, have positive and statistically significant effects on the growth rate of per capita income in African countries." What all this means is that a good amount of economies in Africa suffer from corruption, lack of education, like Liberia. And perhaps encouraging higher levels of education to evoke democracy and reduce corruption may be the key Liberia needs to succeed. But are all these variables truly associated? To find this out, I wrote down these research questions, which were also my associations. The first being, is there an association between perceived government officials' corruption involvement and the economy's management by the Liberian government? And the second said, is there an association between the respondents' highest educational level and the support of democracy within the country? To do this, I looked at certain methods. The methods I used involved the sample, the subsetting, and the measures I took. With the sample, I looked at around 7 Afrobarometer survey taken between 2016 and 2018 that involved 1,200 people and a sampling type of two-stage stratified sampling. In doing so, I picked out the Afrobarometer mesh datasets, narrowed it down to Liberia, and was able to develop my explanatory variables and response variables accordingly. And the measures I took were the following. With the first question that had to do with the government officials' corruption, I collapsed the responses into 4 categories. Some of them, most of them, all of them, and none. I moved categories like NA and categories that didn't answer the question necessarily in order to make the work more understandable. I did the same with the second question that involved managing the economy, and I collapsed it down to 4 responses: very badly, fairly well, and very well. With the third question of the highest level of education, I did the same and narrowed it down to 5 levels of education: none, informal, primary school, secondary school, and tertiary education. And with my last question that involved your opinion on democracy, whether it's preferable, I narrowed it down to 3 categories or 3 levels. Doesn't matter, sometimes non-democratic is preferable and prefers democracy. With the inferential test, I decided to look at the chi-squared test for independence, considering that my variables were all categorical. With the first one, I picked up a null hypothesis of there is no association between perceived government officials' corruption involvement and the economy's management by the Liberian government. The alternative hypothesis was there's an association between the perceived government officials' corruption involvement and the economy's management by the Liberian government. With my second association, I looked now at education and support of democracy. And the first one, which was a null hypothesis, said there is no association between the respondent's highest educational level and the support of democracy within the country. And with the alternative hypothesis, I wrote there is an association between the respondent's highest educational level and the support of democracy within the country. And in doing so, I was able to come up with my results. Now, for association 1, which had to do with the relationship between perceived officials' corruption involvement and the very bad economy management by the Liberian government, I narrowed it down to bad to very bad, considering the fact that on that table, most of the respondents agreed to it being very bad. So I narrowed down very bad economy management in order to make the problem more seen. And in doing so, realized that Using the Pearson's chi-square test, the p-value was 3.293e-11. Such a value shows that using the 95% confidence interval, if it is less than 0.05, it rejects the null hypothesis, meaning that there is an association. 3.2933e-11 happens to also be lower than the significance level of 0.05, and for that, it gives a conclusion that there is a relationship between the perceived government officials' corruption involvement and the economy's management by the Liberian government. The same can be seen for my second association, which has to do with percentage of support of democracy by the educational level. The p-value was 2.869e-09, which also falls within the rejection of the null hypothesis, and also give the conclusion that there is also a relationship between the respondents' high educational level and the support of democracy within the country. What all this means is that overall, the people spoke and the perception suggested probable associations between the before-mentioned variables. Therefore, some reasons for modern-day Liberia could be corruption and democratic crisis, and ways that could better the economy could be higher levels of education and less corruption in order to allow the people to take hold of their democratic freedom and develop. The results seem to be both statistically and practically significant in how it shows an existence in the study, as well as a large enough amount to be meaningful in the real world. However, one could argue that this research, being quite limited, considering the data was based off of perceptions using a survey, may not necessarily be the facts. Now, can the results inform policy? Due to the association existing between people agreeing to a strong level of government official corruption and the government performing badly, therefore, this needs to be further looked upon, and further research and action will need to be taken in order to help the country tackle this issue and move forward. Also, the existence for those who have a higher educational level to support democracy suggests that there must be a push for more education in order to set the youth politically free and spark development. Thank you, and have a good day.